By the time Gideon Hale heard the wagon, the creek had already climbed its banks and started worrying at the road like a dog at a bone. He lifted his head from Hobbs' shoulder, listening through the black cold. There it was again, the cracked rattle of a loose wheel, the slap of frightened reins, and a woman's voice saying something low and fierce that the water snatched away. Gideon was moving before he thought. He swung into the saddle bareback, drove his heels into Hobbs' flanks, and took the cut down to Bitter Brush, crossing at a run, with the smell of wet clay rising hard from the dark and the first spray of creek water hitting his face like thrown gravel. The lantern on the wagon was swinging wild when he saw her. One horse was half sideways in the wash, the other rearing against the traces, and the wagon itself had slewed toward the drop where the bank fell away into the cottonwood roots. The woman on the box seat had wrapped the reins around one wrist and braced both boots, fighting like she meant to shame the flood into backing down. Gideon dropped from Hob before the gelding had fully stopped. He caught the lead horse by the bit, took a kick in the thigh that would purple by morning, and spoke into its white-rimmed eye until it remembered the ground beneath it. Behind him he muttered, more out of old habit than thought, "You were right, Hob. Quiet evening." The woman, breathing hard, pushed soaked hair off her cheek and answered him at once. If that horse recommended this crossing, he ought to be ashamed of himself. Gideon looked up so fast the rain ran down his collar. For a moment he only stared. Nobody but Hob had heard that sort of talk from him in years, and Hob had never once been rude enough to answer. She saw the look and almost smiled, though her mouth was blue with cold. "If you're planning to stand there wondering whether I'm real, mister, I'd prefer you do it after we get this wagon out." He set his shoulder to the wheel. She climbed down beside him without waiting to be told, boots sinking in the mud to the ankle. Together, with Hob leaning into the traces on command and the creek tugging at the spokes, they dragged the wagon back onto the road 1 inch at a time. Gideon could feel the strain all the way through his spine. He liked that about honest work. It asked the whole truth from a body. When it was done, the woman bent over with her hands on her knees, sucking air, and he caught the shape of her then, not through prettiness, though she had some of that still, buried under rain and grit and exhaustion, but through use. She moved like a person long acquainted with weight. Her coat had been mended at both elbows. The knuckles on her left hand were scarred and square. There was a narrow black ribbon tied around her hat, dark enough to vanish in the night unless a lantern found it. "You're heading the wrong way for Sheridan," Gideon said. "I'm not heading for Sheridan." He followed her glance to the road that bent south toward a ridge of darker dark where a few neglected cottonwoods marked an old place. Bell Homestead, empty near 3 years since Ezra Bell's funeral and the auction after. "You can't mean to stay out there." "I can," she said. "I mean to do exactly that." The answer came too fast to be brave talk. It had the sound of something said 3 or 4 times already that day to people who had tried to stop her. He tied the team to the back rail and climbed up to check the wagon bed. Trunks, 2 feed sacks, a crate of jars padded in old quilts, a wooden box of ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, not the cargo of a traveler passing through. A whole life, cut down to what would fit behind a pair of tired bays. "You got somebody waiting?" he asked. "No." He looked back at her. Rain ran off the brim of her hat. She didn't blink it away. "Then you ought not be alone on that place tonight." "I was alone yesterday too," she said. "It didn't kill me." That was answer enough to tell him it had tried. He took Hobbs' reins and started walking the team toward the ridge. She fell into step beside him, one hand on the wagon rail, her breath still rough from the crossing. The night smelled of wet sage and mule sweat and the sharp iron tang of rising water. Once, when the road narrowed, her sleeve brushed his, and she flinched as if she had forgotten another living person could be that close. A little farther on, when the wheels found firmer ground, he said, "Name's Gideon. Clara Bell." The bell settled into him a second late. He stopped walking. Ezra Bell's widow. Her chin lifted, not with pride exactly, but with the last tired scrap of it a person keeps when everything else has been bargained off. Yes. He knew better than to say he'd heard. In country like that, everybody heard. Ezra Bell had taken fever in late spring and been buried before the clover came in. The note on the place had gone to the bank after that. Folks said Calvin Rusk had been waiting on the property like a man waiting on stew to cool. Clara must have read some of that on his face, because she said, "If you've got an opinion, keep it till morning." I'm too wet to argue tonight. He gave a short nod. There's a stove in the lined shack on my lower pasture. Closer than the house. I can get a fire going. She shook her head. If I stop before I see that place, I won't make myself start again. That was one answer. Another sat unspoken under it. If she slept under another roof, even for one night, the land might stop feeling like hers. He walked on. And if you're listening tonight with a lamp on in your kitchen or the last of the daylight sitting blue at your window, tell me where in the world you're hearing this from. There is something fitting about a story like this traveling through so many quiet rooms at once. The Bell place showed itself in pieces as they climbed. First the leaning gate, then the roof line with one corner patched in mismatched shingles, then the barn with half its siding silvered bare by weather. The house had a porch deep enough to promise shade in summer, if a person could keep the boards from lifting. One window still held a lace curtain, yellowed and unmoving in the dark. Gideon felt Clara go still beside him when she saw it. Not because the place was welcoming, because it wasn't gone. Inside, the front room smelled of dust, old ash, and shut-up wood. Clara set the lantern down and stood without taking off her coat, staring at the cold hearth as if it were a face she had once known well and no longer trusted. Gideon crossed to the stove, found kindling in the box beside it, and got flame coaxed out of a coal that should have been dead but wasn't. He had always respected that in a buried ember, it could look finished and still keep one red thought of heat. While the fire caught, Clara uncovered the crate of jars and checked them one by one for breakage. Not fussing, taking stock. Gideon watched her work and saw precision in it. Her hands moved over each lid like a clerk reading figures by touch. On a peg near the door hung Ezra Bell's old slicker. The sight of it changed the room. Gideon looked away first. You knew him? Clara asked quietly. Enough to share a fence line. He knew alfalfa better than anybody this side of Buffalo. A small warmth came into her face at that. He'd like hearing that more than any him they said over him. Gideon fed another stick into the stove. He meant to leave once she was warmed and the team rubbed down, yet his feet stayed where they were. What brings you back tonight? He asked. She unwrapped the oilcloth from the wooden box and laid a hand over the ledgers inside. The bank gave notice. Payment discrepancy, they called it. Said if I wasn't present when the county clerk opened the file in the morning, the claim could be transferred pending review. Mr. Rusk has been kind enough to be available for the transfer. Gideon's jaw set without meaning to. You got proof otherwise? Maybe. She pressed her lips together. Ezra kept everything. Receipts, freight tallies, seed invoices, the survey copy from when the North Spring was marked. If it's in here, I can hold the land. If it isn't, I can't. He thought of Rusk's smooth hands and city hat, of the way he could talk about a pasture as if no living thing had ever slept on it. Clerk won't stay open late for a widow coming in wet from the road. Then I'll be there when the door opens. The fire had begun to throw real heat. Clara pulled off her gloves and held her hands out to it. There was a narrow, pale band on her ring finger, the skin beneath left untouched by summer sun. Gideon looked at his boots. You can leave, she said after a moment, not unkindly. I've borrowed enough of your night. I'll hitch up at dawn. She turned. Why? He could have given the practical answer. Road still soft. Town likely to talk. Rusk not fond of witnesses. But the truth was smaller and stranger. Because when he'd said a foolish thing to his horse in the rain, somebody had answered him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Instead, he said, because a flooded crossing's no place to end our acquaintance. That earned him the full smile this time, quick and tired and gone again. It altered the room more than the fire had. Dawn came bright and pitiless, washing every defect of the Bell place into plain sight. Clapboards split at the corners. Porch steps bowed in the middle. One barn hinge hanging by a single screw. Clara had been up before him, sleeves rolled, sweeping a path through the front room with a corn broom whose handle had been repaired with wire. He saw at once that she had not cried in the night. Whatever grief she did had already been sorted and stacked where she could carry it. They rode into town with the wagon behind them. Gideon kept Hob to an easy gait beside the team, and Clara sat straight on the box with the ledger box on the seat beside her like a second passenger. Sheridan was awake by the time they reached Main Street. Blacksmith hammer ringing, bakery smoke coming sweet through the cool, a boy chasing two hens away from the hotel steps. Heads turned when folks saw Gideon riding in next to a woman in widow's ribbon. Two men outside the feed store stopped talking mid-sentence. Mrs. Lathrop from the mercantile gave Clara one long measuring look and then, to Gideon's surprise, raised two fingers in a quiet salute of welcome. Calvin Rusk was already on the clerk's porch. He leaned on the rail as if the building belonged to him and not the county. He was a handsome man in the careful way some men become handsome by deciding, early, never to be caught disordered. His coat fit too well for ranch work. His boots were polished at the toe. When he smiled at Clara, nothing around his eyes moved. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "I had begun to fear the roads had changed your plans." "They nearly did," she answered. Rusk's gaze slid to Gideon. "Hale, didn't know you had taken to escort work." Gideon dismounted and looped Hobbs' reins without answering. Inside, the clerk spread papers over the scarred oak counter while Clara opened Ezra's ledgers with fingers that did not shake. Gideon stayed a step back, hat in hand, watching. Rusk's complaint was simple enough on its face. Missing interest payment on the medical note that had been folded into the land debt after Ezra's illness, plus a boundary review request regarding the North Spring. Pending settlement, the claim could be transferred for productive stewardship. Rusk said the phrase so gently it sounded almost charitable. Clara turned pages. Freight costs, seed orders, hay tallies, a doctor's bill. Gideon saw her jaw tighten at that. Then she found a receipt stub and flattened it. This amount was paid against the note in May. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. Receipt numbers listed, but the bank copy isn't in the file. Then the bank misplaced it. Rusk spread his hands. Or Ezra intended to pay and never completed it. A common enough confusion in a hard season. Clara's eyes lifted from the ledger and fixed on him. Gideon had seen women angry before. This was colder than anger. "My husband counted fence staples before he bought them. He did not confuse money he no longer had." Something in the room changed. Even the clerk seemed to sit straighter. Rusk's tone stayed pleasant. "Of course, but without the bank copy. Pending review." The clerk interrupted. "The county can delay transfer for 10 days if bond is posted against damages and back use." Clara went still. "How much?" He named the number. Gideon heard her draw breath once and hold it. She did not have it. Gideon knew the figure because he had almost that exact amount in the tobacco tin under the loose floorboard in his bunkhouse, saved across 3 punishing seasons for a starter herd of his own. Rusk knew she didn't have it too. That was the true point of the morning. He turned to Gideon with practiced ease. "I do need a reliable man to ride south with the remuda next week. Good money. Clean arrangement. No reason for neighbors to make other folks' paperwork their trouble." The easy path stood there plain as a gate left open. Gideon could take the job, keep his savings, let the county and the bank and Rusk sort out what powerful men always seem to sort out in their favor. Clara would lose the place by rules written by hands softer than hers. He could ride away by winter with enough stake money to stop bunking under another man's roof. No law said he owed her anything. He looked at Clara. She had not turned to him, had not asked. Pride stood beside her like another person. He reached into his coat, took out the envelope he had brought only because old habits of caution die slow, and laid it on the clerk's desk. "Post it," he said. The room went quiet enough to hear the wall clock ticking. Clara turned then. "Mr. Hale." He kept his eyes on the clerk. "Add my South Meadow lease for temporary grazing rights till review's done. Her team and whatever stock she can keep fed can winter there if it comes to that." Rusk's smile thinned at last. "That is a reckless kindness." Gideon settled his hat back on his head. "No. Reckless is trying bitter brush crossing after dark." Clara's look hit him harder than the horse's kick had. Not gratitude. Something more dangerous. Recognition. By noon the papers were filed, the bond accepted, and every person in town worth the title of gossip had heard that Gideon Hale had staked nearly all he owned on Ezra Bell's widow and her failing patch of land. The Bell place looked smaller in daylight, but less defeated under company. Gideon spent the next morning resetting porch braces, then the next mending the hinge on the barn door. Clara did not thank him every quarter hour, which he appreciated. She worked beside him as if help were best repaid by matching it. When he pried up rotten boards, she carried sound lumber from the wagon. When he showed her how the west fence had loosened where the frost heaved the posts, she fetched staples and the hammer before he asked. By afternoon he had learned she could drive nails clean, sharpen a kitchen blade on sandstone, and keep accounts in her head more accurately than most men could with pencil and squinting. He also learned she had a way of answering the things he said to Hob without looking at him. As if she were stepping quietly into a room he had long ago stopped believing another human would enter. Hob says this post won't hold. Gideon muttered one windy hour as he tested the split grain. Then Hob has finally shown good sense, Clara said from the wire stretcher, and he heard himself laugh before he could stop it. The sound startled them both. News traveled along fence lines faster than weather. By the end of the week, half the county had chosen a side, most of them from the safety of somebody else's porch. Old Mrs. Lathrop sent over a sack of coffee and claimed she'd bought too much. Amos Pruitt, the blacksmith, arrived with a box of salvaged nails and pretended he just happened to be passing. 3 boys from Rusk's place rode by slow enough to be insulting and tipped their hats with grins too easy to trust. At church on Sunday, Clara sat in the second pew and felt more eyes on the back of her neck than the preacher did, but she kept her spine straight and sang every hymn she knew. The land itself made its own judgments. The North Spring was running thinner than it should have been for that time of year. Gideon followed the trickle upslope one afternoon and found fresh shovel marks near the old diversion trench. Someone had been tampering with the flow, nudging water eastward toward Rusk's lower pasture. Not enough to be dramatic. Just enough to make Bell ground look tired and Bell records look poor by November. When he told Clara, she went very still in that dangerous way of hers. Ezra wrote every flow rate in planting season. Morning and evening both. You still have it. In one of the farm books. That night they sat at the kitchen table under the lamp, going through ledgers while the wind worried the eaves. Clara licked her thumb to separate pages, eyes moving quick over dates and figures. Gideon watched her trace a column once and then recite the whole line aloud. Seed, freight, labor, yield. She missed nothing. There was a scar at the base of her throat he had not noticed before, white and narrow, probably from some long ago kitchen accident. His gaze caught there once too long, and he looked back to the books. Here, she said, sliding one over. Spring output, 3 years running. It drops only after Ezra got sick. You think Rusk started then? I think a man who covets a thing generally begins before he announces it. He grunted. That sounds like something you learned the expensive way. Her mouth bent a little. Widowhood teaches bookkeeping of all kinds. He wanted to ask about Ezra then, and did not. Wanted to tell her about the woman he had buried on a bright morning that should have belonged to spring, and did not. Silence sat between them, but it had changed. It was no longer an empty room. It was a table with 2 people choosing not to leave. Toward midnight, Clara rose to heat coffee and paused with one hand on the stove lid. Why do you talk to him? She asked. Gideon knew at once she meant Hob. He looked through the window at the gelding's dark shape in the barn lot, head lowered into the wind. Started on trail drives. Long miles. A man says things. And after it seemed foolish to stop. She poured water into the pot. Steam rose and softened the lamplight around her face. No, she said. Not foolish. He waited. She set 2 cups down, sat again, and looked not at him but at the ledger in front of her. Grief is a house with the table still set. The room held the words without trying to improve them. Gideon looked at her hands around the cup, at the pale mark where her ring had been, and felt some locked place in him shift one notch open. He said, because anything larger would have broken in the saying, yes. A few days later the moral choice sharpened until even a stubborn man could no longer pretend it was only chores and neighborliness. The rail buyer from downstate came through Sheridan looking to contract winter hay and spring oats. Rusk had money enough to corner the bid if Bell water rights stayed clouded and Bell fields went half dry. Gideon, if he kept his own name clear and his savings where he'd hidden what little remained, could still cut himself a deal managing the South shipment. It would mean land of his own by next summer. A sober dream. The first he had allowed himself in years. Instead, he spent his days hauling stone to rebuild Clara's spring box and his nights going over Ezra's measurements, looking for the seam in Rusk's story. Town noticed. Some approved in silence. Some called him mule stubborn. One evening outside the saloon, a freighter named Dobbins said loud enough to carry. Hale must like arguing with widows and horses. At least one of them answers back. Gideon turned so slowly the laughter died on its own. Good thing for you I prefer better company. The men on the porch looked away first. Clara heard about it from Amos and met Gideon at the barn with a bruise-colored sunset behind her. You don't need to keep spending your skin on my behalf. I wasn't aware I'd spent much. You gave up work. You posted bond. You are one insult away from a fist fight at any hour, and don't tell me you aren't. He forked hay into Hobbs' stall. Wasn't planning to tell you anything of the kind. She stood in the doorway, arms folded against the cold. There is still time to step clear, Gideon. Rusk hasn't closed the gate entirely. If you took that trail contract, nobody in town would think worse of you. He rested both hands on the pitchfork handle. The barn smelled of hay dust and horse sweat and the clean, familiar leather of his tack. It was the smell of every place he had ever managed to keep from becoming home. Would you? She did not answer right away. No, she said at last. I'd understand it. That's not the same thing. He nodded. Then I won't. The first real freeze silvered the grass 2 mornings later. By then they had proof enough to know Rusk had interfered with the spring, but not enough yet to force the county's hand. They needed the original survey copy Ezra had mentioned, and perhaps a bank receipt still unaccounted for. Clara believed both might be in a strongbox he had hidden before the auction, somewhere on the property where scavengers had not thought to look. Ezra had trusted ordinary things, a flour bin, a loose hearth brick, a false wall in the tack room. Gideon began checking them all. At the edge of November, with the sky that hard pale color which means weather is thinking about you, Rusk rode up the lane himself. He sat his sorrel as if horses were furniture designed for his convenience. Mrs. Bell, he called, easy as ever. Hale. Clara stepped off the porch and closed the distance enough to show she would meet him on open ground. Gideon came out of the barn behind her, not crowding, only present. Rusk nodded toward the north field. You have until the first heavy snow before your arrears begin drawing further penalties. After that, sentiment will not help. I'd advise practical choices. Clara's face gave him nothing. Your advice has been very active around my spring already. His brows lifted. A serious accusation. Gideon said, not as serious as moving water off a widow's land and calling the result poor stewardship. Rusk let the silence stretch. He was good at that sort of thing. Be careful, Hale. Men who own very little can lose it quickest. When he rode away, the sorrel's hoofbeats faded into a wind that had teeth in it. Clara stood looking after him long past when dust had settled. He thinks he's already won. He mostly has, Gideon said. She turned to him then, sharp. He respected her for that too. She never asked for comfort in the shape of lies. All right, she said. Then let's find the thing that makes him wrong. That night, with the lamp turned low and the cold pressing blue against the windows, they opened Ezra's last ledger and found a notation so small it could have been mistaken for a blot if Clara had not known her husband's hand. Survey duplicate secured in spring box during high theft month. Payment copy with it. Gideon looked up. Spring box. The old upper one, Clara said, already reaching for her coat. Not the field box we rebuilt. The original stone catch-up near the cottonwoods. He looked toward the door. The wind had shifted north. Storm coming. Yes. He studied her face, the set of her mouth. He heard Rusk's warning, saw his own chance at escape standing open still if he chose it, and felt the whole question of his life narrowing to a gate latch. Stay safe. Stay uninvolved. Keep what little is yours. Or ride into weather for a woman who had already become harder to leave than he knew what to do with. At the start of trouble, people like to imagine they already know which choice they would make. I wonder about that myself. When the right thing asks for more than pride and costs you sleep, money, safety, maybe the whole shape of the future you planned in secret. Do you still take it? Or do you call it foolish and keep warm? Hold that question. The night did not wait long to put it to them. The storm did not announce itself with thunder. It came in the older Western way, by subtraction. The ridgeline disappeared first, then the far fence. Then the color left the world so completely that even the sage looked made of ash. By the time Gideon saddled Hob and harnessed Clara's team, the air had turned to knives, and the road up to the cottonwoods was only a memory under skittering snow. They went anyway. Clara rode in the wagon to keep the lantern and tools dry beneath a canvas flap, while Gideon ranged ahead on Hob, finding the line of the old ditch by instinct and buried habit. He had spent enough winters on open country to read what the wind did to drifts, how it combed one side of a draw and packed the other. His skill was not speed. It was listening with his whole body until the land admitted what shape it had taken underneath the weather. Twice the wagon lurched axle deep and had to be levered free. Once a fence post loomed out of the white where there should have been none, and Gideon knew at once that somebody had moved the line. Rusk. Even in storm the man was reaching. At the upper cottonwoods, they found the old spring half buried beneath crusted snow and a tumble of brush someone had thrown over it to hide the stonework. Gideon chopped at the ice with the back of a spade, while Clara knelt barehanded to pull branches away. Water hissed black beneath the crust. "There," she said. A loosened capstone shifted. Under it sat a tobacco tin wrapped in waxed cloth gone stiff with cold. Clara snatched it up and tucked it inside her coat. For one beat, they looked at each other through blown snow, both understanding the same thing. They had it. Not hope. Proof. Then shouting came thin through the white from downslope. 3 riders. 1 horse already down. Gideon swung into the saddle and rode toward the sound. He found them by the chaos before he found them by sight. Cattle bawling, a lantern rolling in the snow, a young man on one knee trying and failing to drag his trapped leg clear from under a mare that had gone through the skin ice of the creek edge. The other 2 riders were Rusk's hands. One saw Gideon and cursed. Stock drifted over. "We were turning them. By Cutting Bell fence." Gideon snapped. No answer. The young man on the ground was Lee Rusk, Calvin's sister's boy, old enough to shave badly and young enough still to think himself unbreakable. He was white with pain, lips trembling against it. Gideon could have ridden past. Could have taken Clara and the tin and gone straight for the house. Then town. Then the clerk's office with his evidence wrapped dry beneath her coat. Every second mattered. If the papers were lost, Clara lost the land. If the boy died, he died under the weight of a scheme not wholly his own. Gideon dismounted into the creek without taking time to curse the cold. Water filled his boots and knifed up his calves. "Get the mare's head up," he barked. "Not like that, you idiot, easy. You want her thrashing?" Clara was there a breath later, taking the lantern, steady as if chaos had merely been another chore. Snow clung to her lashes. "Tell me what to do." He met her eyes once. She already knew what the choice was costing. She did not try to make it cheaper. Hold the light. They worked by inches. Gideon calmed the mare with one hand on her jaw while the hired men hauled at the traces. Clara laid her coat under Lee's shoulders to keep him out of the water and talked to him in a voice so plain and level it seemed to pin him to the world. When the mare found her feet, Gideon and the others dragged Lee clear. His leg bent wrong below the knee. He cried out once, then clamped his teeth hard enough to bloody his lip. "Don't move him yet," Clara said. She had already torn a strip from her petticoat hem and was binding splints from willow lengths Gideon snapped off the bank. "Lee, listen to me. You keep your eyes here." The boy stared at her. "You're Bell's widow." "Yes." "I'm sorry," he whispered, and Gideon knew he was not talking about the broken leg. They lashed him to a sled of fence rails and harness leather. One of Rusk's men started to take the tobacco tin from Clara when she climbed back to the wagon. Gideon's hand closed on the man's wrist with no wasted motion. "Try that again." The man blanched. Not because Gideon was larger. Because some kinds of quiet, if pushed too far, stop looking gentle and start looking final. They turned for the house through near wideout, Lee groaning whenever the sled hit rough ground. The cattle had scattered. The creek was rising under a skin of new ice. Halfway home, Clara leaned forward from the wagon seat and shouted over the wind. "The tin's only papers. Ezra kept duplicates in a leather folio too. If the first copy smears, we'll need the second." "Where?" "In the wagon box under the false bottom." A minute later the wagon jolted hard. One wheel dropped through a hidden shelf at the creek crossing where the bank had slumped. The whole rig canted toward the black water. Gideon got the team stopped, but the rear half of the wagon hung over the cut, lurching lower each time the creek bit another mouthful of mud away. Clara did not scream. She went for the box. "No," Gideon said. "It's there." I said no. She met him over the blasting wind, and there was no fear in her face now, only arithmetic. If those papers are lost, he takes everything. He swore, shoved the reins at one of Rusk's hands, and dropped down the bank. Clay broke beneath his boots. He caught the wagon rail, reached under the seat, found the hidden latch by feel, and dragged out the leather folio just as the wheel shifted again with a rotten crack. The creek surged against his knees. For one brief, impossible second, he thought of Sarah, of blood on clean sheets, of the helplessness of arriving too late to the one room that mattered. Then Hobbs screamed from above. a sound Gideon had heard only twice in 15 years, and a looped rope came whipping down through the snow. Clara had thrown it one-handed and clean. He hooked his elbow through, jammed the folio inside his coat, and scrambled as the bank gave way under him. Cold water caught one boot and almost kept it. Hobbs sat back against the line on command, muscles bunching under winter hide, and Clara braced with both hands on the rope like a person hauling her own heart out of a river. They made the top together. The wagon went over behind them with a splintering crash and vanished nose first into the creek, lantern and all. For 1 second nobody moved. Then Lee moaned from the sled, and the world started again. By the time they got back to the Bell house, Gideon's hands were blue to the knuckles and Clara's hair had come loose in dark, wet ropes down her neck. They got Lee inside, laid him on the settee, fed wood to the stove till the lids glowed faintly red, and sent Amos Pruitt's youngest boy racing to fetch Doc Marin through the storm. One of Rusk's hands slipped away before the doctor arrived. The other stayed because leaving a boy with that kind of fracture to a blizzard was more than even hired loyalty would carry. Doc Marin set the leg while Lee bit on a folded strap. Clara held the boy's shoulders. Gideon gripped the ankle until the bone found its place with a sick sound he would hear in sleep later. When it was done and laudanum had quieted Lee's face, the doctor peeled off his spectacles and looked from Clara to Gideon to the damp leather folio on the table. "If that's what I think it is, you'd best pray the county office has a fire lit early." Clara opened the folio with hands that now shook only from cold. Inside lay the survey duplicate, wrapped in oilskin, and behind it the missing bank receipt with Ezra Bell's signature and the cashier's stamp gone faint but legible. There were also 2 loose pages Gideon had not expected. Freight notes in Ezra's hand documenting reduced water flow after Calvin Rusk ordered ditch work east of the Bell line, plus names of men present. Amos Pruitt's name was one of them. So was Doc Marin's. And Lee, drifting under laudanum but awake enough to hear, opened his eyes and rasped, "My uncle moved the markers after Mr. Bell got sick. Said nobody watches a man's land as close when he's learning to die." The room fell so quiet the stove seemed loud. Doc Marin looked like he had bitten metal. Amos, just arrived with snow on his shoulders and smoke in his beard, took off his hat very slowly. He was a man who tugged at one earlobe when troubled. Now he nearly pulled it off. "I thought he was only widening the stock path," he said. "God help me." Clara did not speak. Gideon knew why. Some truths arrive so late they feel like mockery. Morning was still 2 dark hours off when the sheriff came with a deputy and a provisional possession order signed at Rusk's urging the previous afternoon. Time to take effect if Bell default remained unresolved at sunrise. The deputy stepped onto the porch stamping snow off his boots, all official discomfort. Sheriff Talbot looked past him into the warm lamplit room and took in the splinted boy, the doctor, Amos, Gideon dripping thaw water on the floorboards, and Clara standing straight behind the table with Ezra's papers under her hand. "Seems I may have been sent early," Talbot said. Gideon reached for his coat. "Then let's make you late enough to matter." The hearing could not be held before dawn, but evidence could be preserved. Talbot took statements there by the stove while the storm wore itself thin against the windows. Amos swore to the ditch work. Doc Marin identified the receipt and his own bill folded into the note. Lee, gray-faced and sweating from pain, stared at the ceiling and said every ugly detail he knew. Not because he was brave exactly, because Clara had held his shoulders while his leg was set and treated him like a boy worth saving. When Talbot came to Gideon, pen poised, he said, "You knew helping her would cost you." "Yes, and you still did." Gideon looked toward Hob in the barn lot, dim beyond the frosted glass. A man can only ride one trail at a time. By the time the eastern sky showed a thin iron seam of light, the storm had spent its fury. Rusk still had reach. He still had influence at the bank and plenty of men who preferred comfort to truth. But for the first time since Clara came back over Bitterbrush Crossing, his version of the world was no longer the only one written down. After the violence of weather and decision, the house fell into that strange quiet known only to places where people have nearly lost each other and did not. Lee slept. Amos went to start coffee. Doc Marin dozed in a chair with his hat tipped over his eyes. Sheriff Talbot had taken the statements into town, promising the clerk would open early and the judge would see the file before breakfast. Clara found Gideon on the back step, elbows on his knees, staring at the paling yard. Steam rose from his drying coat hung by the door. His boots sat beside him, one still leaking creek water. Without asking, she set a blanket around his shoulders and crouched to inspect the raw skin at his hands. "You'll lose nothing but comfort," she said. "Which men like you treat as optional anyway." He almost smiled. "You make it sound foolish. I make it sound familiar." She carried a basin out and knelt in front of him. The water smelled faintly of rosemary from one of the jars she had saved. When she lowered his hands into it, heat bit so sharply he hissed through his teeth. "There," she said softly. "Feel that? That means they're still yours." He watched her wring out the cloth and lay it over his knuckles. Morning light had reached her face now. Fatigue showed plain around her eyes, but something gentler sat there too, something unguarded by accident. A lock of hair had escaped and curled damply at her temple. He wanted, with a force that almost embarrassed him, to smooth it back. Instead he said, "Sarah used to keep rosemary hanging by the stove." The name stayed between them. He had not spoken it aloud to another person in a long while. Clara did not fill the silence. After a moment she asked, "Your wife?" He nodded. "And our child?" "Same day." Her hand paused on the cloth. "I'm sorry." He looked out across the yard where the storm had laid clean lines of snow against the fence. "I came home to a house too quiet for one life to bear. Hob was in the lot. Needed feeding. Needed brushing. Needed plain things. I started talking because there was sound in me and nowhere decent to put it." Clara sat back on her heels. "Ezra wasn't quiet when he was well." He hummed, tapped door frames as he passed, argued with pots on the stove as if they had insulted him. "After he died, I kept thinking the house would answer if I addressed it correctly." She let out one small breath that might have been a laugh if laughter had taken the wrong road and wandered into sorrow. It never did. He turned his hands under the cloth and caught her wrist lightly before she could pull away. Not possession, only recognition. "You answered." Her eyes lifted to his. The cold had left enough pink in her face to remind him that winter was not permanent law, only season. Maybe I was tired of hearing only my own silence. He held her gaze a moment longer than safety allowed. Maybe I was too. She sat down beside him on the step. Their shoulders did not touch at first. Then they did, because the blanket shifted and neither of them moved it back. After a long while she said, almost to the morning, "The heart heals crooked, but it still knows how to carry love. This, right here, is the part that brings people back to stories. Not the danger, not even the victory, not yet. It's the moment after the worst has passed when two broken souls recognize the shape of each other without trying to sand down the edges. If you felt that settle somewhere in you, that quiet relief of being seen, this is where a like and a subscribe means something real. It means you want more stories that leave a lamp burning in the window." Footsteps sounded inside. Clara rose and went in ahead of him. By full morning, the house had become a place of practical mercies. Amos fried salt pork and pretended not to notice the softness that had entered the room. Doc Marin reset Lee's splints and instructed him with gruff tenderness. Hob, dried and blanketed, stood at the fence chewing patiently through a nosebag as if he had been pulling lonely men out of rivers all his life. Near noon, Gideon and Clara rode into town again, this time side by side. The county office was crowded before they arrived. Word had outrun them. Mrs. Lathrop had taken a chair in the hall for no stated reason. Two freighters leaned by the stair. Amos came in behind with his shirt still smelling of forged smoke. Sheriff Talbot stood near the clerk's desk, holding the storm-soaked statements, now copied clean. Calvin Rusk was already there, of course, immaculate in a dark coat, though his eyes sharpened when he saw Lee carried in on a door plank by two ranch hands. Rusk's confidence did not vanish. Men like that do not surrender it quickly, but it had to make room for caution. The hearing itself was less dramatic than gossip would later make it. Western justice often is. No one banged tables. No one delivered speeches grand enough to deserve repeating. The clerk reviewed the receipt. Doc Marin verified the bill. Amos described the ditch work and the moved markers. Lee, with pain sweating through his collar, told the judge what he had seen Calvin order and when. Clara laid Ezra's survey duplicate and flow notes on the desk in a stack, so neat it looked like a closing argument made of paper instead of breath. Rusk disputed, redirected, diminished. He was good at that, but each time he smoothed one wrinkle, another witness set it back. Gideon said only what he knew firsthand. The tampered trench, The shifted fence post revealed under storm drift the condition of the upper spring box. He did not embellish. Truth served plain is harder to fight. When the judge asked about temporary control of the grazing lease until boundaries were restored, the clerk glanced toward Gideon. Given Mr. Hale's bond and use right, transfer into his management pending final plat would simplify matters. It was the sort of suggestion half the room considered sensible. Clara had the claim. Gideon had posted the money. A married arrangement would likely follow, and men in offices often confuse convenience with fairness. Gideon did not look at Clara first. He looked at the clerk. Right, Mrs. Bell. The words were quiet, but the room heard them. The clerk blinked. Pardon, it's her land, Gideon said. Right, Mrs. Bell. Clara's face changed by one small degree. So small most people would have missed it. Sheriff Talbot did not. Neither did Mrs. Lathrop in the hall. Nobody praised him aloud. Nobody needed to. Restraint has its own witness. The ruling came just before dusk. Bell title held pending final survey confirmation, with immediate restoration of spring access, suspension of penalties, and investigation of fraudulent interference in the ditch and note administration. Rusk was not arrested on the spot, because life is rarely arranged for applause. But he lost the transfer, the winter hay leverage, and the easy presumption that his version of things would always arrive first and be believed longest. By weeks in, the bank had replaced its cashier under scrutiny from men who suddenly remembered their consciences. By months in, the rail buyer contracted Clara's hay and oats anyway, on strength of Ezra's books and her winter plan. Rusk kept his dignity in the formal sense. He tipped his hat to the judge, collected his gloves, and left with his back straight. Yet every person in that room understood a different order had begun. There are defeats that shout and defeats that merely stop receiving obedience. His was the second kind. Winter settled in earnest after that, which meant victory turned practical very quickly. Rights restored do not chop firewood. Vindication does not mend rafters. Gideon moved into the Bell bunkroom for the season under the respectable pretense that the South Meadow cattle needed daily attention, and the line shack stove had finally given up its last argument. Clara protested once because form required it, then handed him a list of repairs too heavy for one pair of shoulders and got on with living. The community, having taken the full measure of the story now that its ending could no longer harm them, softened visibly. Mrs. Lathrop sent lamp oil. Amos rebuilt the wagon box that had gone into the creek. Doc Marin came by with licorice root for Lee's pain and stayed to eat stew. Lee himself, ashamed enough to be useful, spent 6 weeks on the Bell settee and repaid the rescue by copying Ezra's ledgers clean into new books under Clara's direction. He learned to respect her arithmetic and Gideon's silences equally. In the long evenings, when wind combed the eaves and the stove lid clicked as it cooled, Clara and Gideon found their way by ordinary things. He taught her which mare would bite unless approached from the left, and how to read coming snow by the smell of iron in the air. She taught him how Ezra used double entry marks to catch missing weight in freight tallies, and why keeping receipts folded inside hymnals was superior to keeping them in desk drawers where men went looking. Once she mended the cuff of his coat, while he sat near enough to hear the thread pass cloth. Once he whittled her a new spoon handle and sanded it with such care, she ran her thumb over the grain twice before speaking. No declaration announced what was happening between them. Their audience, if they had one beyond Hob and the kitchen lamp, would have needed patience. But patience is what turns company into trust. And trust, in a hard country, is the first name love often goes by. By March the snow had gone from the south faces, and the Bell place began to look less like something salvaged and more like something chosen. The porch stood square. The spring ran clear in its proper line. Seed orders were placed under Clara's name and signed with a hand that had stopped trembling months ago. Gideon took to leaving his hat on the peg by the door instead of carrying it back to the bunkroom every night. One evening Lee noticed, said nothing, and smiled into his coffee. When the final surveyor came out from Cheyenne with chain and transit to mark the corrected boundary, the whole business turned almost absurdly simple. The original stone sat exactly where Ezra's notes said it would, once the brush and false markers were cleared. Truth had been waiting under weather and deceit both. It had only needed stubborn people to scrape it clean. Rusk sold 2 outlying parcels that spring to cover what the investigation cost him. He kept the big house east of town, still nodded to folks in the street, still wore polished boots. But men stopped asking his opinion first. The rail buyer took dinner with Clara instead. The waterboard replaced him with Amos, who distrusted paperwork enough to read every line twice. Influence, once interrupted, does not always recover. On the first warm evening fit for sitting outdoors, Gideon found Clara on the porch watching Hob graze the greening strip below the fence. The gelding had a little more gray in his muzzle than the year before and carried himself like an old soldier who had seen men fail and not held it against them. Clara had one of Ezra's ledgers open on her lap, though she was not reading it. Her hand rested on the cover the way one rests a hand on a closed door that no longer needs opening to prove what lies behind it. Gideon leaned against the post. "You still answering horses?" "Only the important ones." He looked out over the meadow, at the shallow shine of the restored ditch, at the house lamp beginning to show itself in the window behind them. "I've been thinking. That can be dangerous." "So I'm told." She tilted her face up to him. Age had not diminished her beauty. It had refined it into something steadier than prettiness and far harder to counterfeit. About what? He could have said marriage. Could have said future. Could have said he had walked around his own life for years like a man circling a skittish colt, afraid one wrong move would send it bolting again. Instead, he said the truest small thing. "I'd like my hat to keep that peg permanent." Clara looked at the empty air just inside the door where his hat already hung most nights, and the corner of her mouth trembled. "It's a good peg." He breathed out, a laugh and a surrender in one. "Is that a yes?" "That," she said, "is me trying not to scare you by sounding too pleased." He sat beside her then. Their hands found each other without ceremony. The way creek water finds the old channel once you move the stones that were never meant to block it. Months later, when summer had turned the meadow thick and the cottonwoods held a deep green shade over the upper spring, Lee came by on a straight-heeled leg to deliver the first of the new rail contracts. Clara signed at the kitchen table, while Gideon argued mildly with a stubborn mare in the yard, and Hob dozed in the sun like a saint who had retired from miracles. There was bread cooling on the sill, a jar of rosemary by the stove, and two hats hanging side by side on the peg near the door, and when the day softened toward evening, Clara stepped onto the porch, laid her hand over Gideon's on the rail, and said, "What stays isn't what you buried. It's what you kept tending," while Hob grazed below the kitchen window and lamplight poured gold across the yard. "Next time, I'll tell you about the schoolteacher who opened a package from St. Louis and found a marshal's badge wrapped in her dead brother's handkerchief, and why the quiet rancher next door went pale the moment he saw it. Until then, take gentle care of the things that have been faithful to you. Good night."